Greetings, vinyl community. This will be another edition of Too Many Records, way too many records to fit into a video, so I will necessarily whip right through these for the most part, but I'll stop and chat about those. I still have something to stop and chat about. And I'll start with the personal news, which is that my latest album, Rat's Alley, is again available on vinyl. Here is the lovely lilac-colored vinyl. And I was planning all along that the people who had pre-ordered and gotten the first pressing, which had a very slight defect, were going, it only affects a few seconds, but it shouldn't have been there, would receive replacement copies. And as it turned out, the pressing plant sent me a batch of extra copies, an overrun, without covers of just the vinyl. So I thought, well, that's perfect, because the people who did that pre-order and got the defective copies already have perfectly good covers. But I have to send them the replacement in something, so I've been repurposing some old album covers, and they've been getting things along the line of this. That was just a bit of fun. So I did go through my Bandcamp, and I think everybody who purchased the original copy has now gotten a copy of the second pressing. And if I forgot you, let me know. Next up, Big Grail for me. When I saw this on the wall, it just called out to me. I've been looking for a long time, and I've mentioned this in past videos that it was a grail, but it's not a rare album, but it's a great, great album, and I've been looking for a really nice condition. And it's hard to get without a lot of ring wear. This one still has a substantial amount of ring wear, but pretty good, and the disc is beautiful. It's an original 2i Columbia copy of Miles Davis, In a Silent Way, one of my favorite albums of all time, one of the first jazz albums I owned back in the mid-70s. Here's the 2i Columbia label, and here's the original Columbia inner sleeve with all those late 60s albums on display, like this is clearly a 1969 sleeve with Blood, Sweat, and Tears and Nashville Skyline, Moby Grape 69, and so on. But this was just wonderful to find. When I saw this on the wall of the record shop, it just called out to me. Another classic of jazz from roughly that area, somewhat earlier, Free Jazz, a collective improvisation by the Ornette Coleman Double Quartet, 2 reeds, 2 trumpets, 2 bass, 2 drums. And this is an interesting copy because it has the die cut, shows the Jackson Pollock artwork, and it's laminated. So that looks like an early copy. But the vinyl is on that mid-70s Atlantic label with the Warner Communications logo on there. And the inner sleeve, assuming this is the original inner sleeve, is definitely from 1975, judging by all the records that are being advertised on it. So this is a mid-70s copy of the album, but it has a cover that really looks like an earlier pressing. I'm very surprised to see this plastic lamination on a copy from that early, and it is, I don't know if you can see that it's peeling there, so definitely a laminate. Brand new pressing from the, well, pretty brand new, from the Blue Note 80 series, Pete LaRocca Basra, with Joe Henderson on tenor, Steve Kuhn on piano, Steve Swallow on bass, and of course Pete LaRocca on drums. It was a great record. Apparently LaRocca and Steve Swallow were tripping on LSD when this was recorded, but you wouldn't know. Classic Blue Note sound still. More great jazz from Sonny Rollins, 1972's Next Album. This was Sonny Rollins' first album after his second hiatus. Everybody knows about the hiatus he took in, I think, the early 60s when he went out to the Williamsburg Bridge in Manhattan every day for like 2 years and spent the entire day practicing. and was not appearing in public or recording during that time. But he took another hiatus at the beginning of the 70s, 69, 70, I think. And he traveled to the Caribbean, he went to Jamaica, he went to India and studied meditation, and he returned in 1972 with this album. Definitely shows that Caribbean influence on a track like the Everywhere Calypso. He's got a version of Poinciana on here. Some pretty longish tracks, give him a lot of scope for soloing. Playing in the Yard is 10 minutes 25. Poinciana is 10 minutes. Skylark by Hoagy Carmichael, 10 minutes. So he's doing some classic stuff, not really getting into very experimental territory, but definitely expanding his scope on the saxophone. A man with a great commitment to learning his art throughout his life, and he's still with us, so hooray for Sonny Rollins. Speaking of the Caribbean, here's a little music from the None Such Explorer series, The Real Bahamas. This is interesting for being the source of some things that, some little song snatches that turned up in Incredible String Band records, and Grateful Dead. This is the source of that We Bid You Good Night. That's known from many a Grateful Dead concert. And while we're in that vein, famous for his Calypso recordings, Harry Belafonte. Finding this at the local record shop was a great thrill, because this was a record that my parents had when I was a kid. When I was 5 years old, this was one of my favorite things to hear. Harry Belafonte with a lot of great folk music, some great Caribbean-inflected calypso-style music. Mama Luka Boo Boo is on here. Man Smart, Woman Smarter. Great Man Piaba, which is a little risque for the young folks. Jamaica Farewell, of course, Deo is on here. The Marching Saints. Each side is themed, so there's some sort of multinational pieces on side 3 with Hava Nagila, Danny Boy, Merci Bon Dieu, Kukuru Kuku Paloma, Shenandoah. A real nostalgia rush, too, is this album. This is a mono copy. I'm pretty sure that the copy my parents had the big living stereo banner across the top. But I'm not complaining. Stanley Clarke, first solo album. This is a killer. Great band. He has, let's see, Jan Hammer on Moog, electric piano, organ, and acoustic piano. He's got Tony Williams on drums and Bill Connor on guitar. And of course, Mr. Clarke himself on an assortment of basses. A little vocal on one track, but mostly this is very powerful, very well composed, crazy fusion. This is crazy fusion. John Serry from 1979 on Chrysalis, of all labels, not a label you associate with jazz and fusion. This is something that I knew nothing about. I was actually confusing it with another record I think I've seen on the vinyl community, and I don't remember who that artist is. But I picked this up just on speculation. Turned it out to be quite interesting, really bursting with ideas. The pieces are very dense and go from one little section to another quite frequently. It's sort of an ADHD music. And Seri is a keyboardist. He plays a lot of electronic keyboards as well as piano. He's got Bob Shepard on sax, Barry Finnerty on guitars, Gordon Johnson on bass, Flim Johnson on bass, Carlos Vega on drum kit. He's got some tuned percussion and a little bit of vocals. Wordless though. I didn't even notice the vocals, to tell you the truth. classic triple LP from Carla Bley and Paul Haynes. This is basically a modern opera, Escalator Over the Hill, a 3 LP set with a nice fat libretto here. Jack Bruce appears as one of the vocalists. Linda Ronstadt is one of the vocalists. Very out there. And from the same family, Michael Mantler movies with Carla Bley, also Larry Coryell and Steve Swallow, whom you might remember from the Pete LaRocca album a couple of albums back, way back when, as well as Tony Williams. It's the same group of guys. They play on every record, don't they? And that's a terrific record, too. Friends by Oregon from 1977. This is the middle one of a run of 3 albums that Oregon did where they had guest musicians. The first being the previous year's Together with Elvin Jones joining the band. And this was followed by violin with Zbigniew Seifert on violin joining the Oregon Quartet. On this one they have multiple friends. There are 2 tracks each with David Earl Johnson on percussion, Benny Lee Wallace on saxophone, and Larry Karush on piano, plus 2 tracks just by the original Oregon Quartet, but those are both compositions by other composers outside of Oregon. One is Time Remembered by Bill Evans, and the other is Timeless by John Abercrombie, who of course made a number of records with Ralph Towner from Oregon. Oregon, of course, was a kind of spin-off of the Paul Winter Consort, because all 4 members had been in the Paul Winter Consort, along with Winter himself and David Darling on cello. Well, David Darling was the one person of that lineup who didn't go on to be in Oregon, but he made this record for ECM, which has Colin Walcott from Oregon on it, Steve Kuhn on piano. Where have we heard these names before? They all play on one another's records. Jan Garbarek on tenor and soprano saxophones, Harold Anderson on bass, and Oscar Castro Neves on guitar. Bit of an ECM All-Stars lineup there. This is a classic ECM release, as is Jan Garbarek with Ralph Towner. It's those same names yet again. Same people. This is Dees with Garbarek on saxophones and wood flute, Ralph Towner on 12-string and classical guitars, joined on 3 tracks by the sound of a wind harp, and on 1 track by a brass sextet, creating this sort of dense and foggy sound in the background, a chordal backdrop for Jan Garbarek's explorations. This is a German pressing, again, classic ECM. More classic ECM, the Italian trumpeter Enrico Rava, The Plot. And I've taken most of these out of the plastic sleeves for you, but this one I'm not going to because the lamination on this German copy is just really delicate and falling apart. Some familiar names yet again, John Abercrombie on guitar and Norwegian rhythm section of Palle Danielsen on bass and John Christensen on drums. Still more ECM, Gary Burton Quintet, Dreams So Real, music by Carla Bley. Gary Burton is joined by Mick Goodrick and Pat Metheny on guitars, Steve Swallow on bass, back to that those other records with Steve Swallow, Bob Moses on drums, and there they all are sort of appearing in a very cool photo sequence. And one more for the ECM group, which is going to segue into the next batch of records, which will be the classical finds. Steve Reich Tehillim. As I make this video, it is Steve Reich's birthday. He is 85 years old today on October 3rd. This is a wonderful ritualistic piece, a piece drawing on Reich's Hebraic background, a devotional piece, and very engaging piece of music. The ritualistic aspect of it is very moving, but the sound has a strong beat to it. So there's a folk music, a Middle Eastern folk sound that is very moving in the physical sense. So Tehillim on ECM. Back in a sec. Cheers. Max Neuhaus, Electronics and Percussion, 5 Realizations by Max Neuhaus, music by Earl Brown, Morton Feldman, Silvano Bussotti, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, and John Cage. Charles Ives String Quartets on Vox. This is, you can tell it's old because it's got just textured paper on the back, no liner notes. The liner notes are on an insert. And one notable thing about the pressing is that the engineer is one Dr. Rudolf van Gelder. And sure enough, there's the RVG stamp in the dead wax. On None Such, 20th Century Flute Music, performed by Harvey Solberger. Starts off with the famous solo flute piece, Density 21.5 by Edgar Varese. Darius Milhaud, 6 Little Symphonies and L'Homme et son désir, the ballet The Man and His Desire. The 6 Little Symphonies are not what you might think of as symphonies. They're 6 brief 3-movement chamber pieces for like 9, 10 instruments, or in the case of number 6, for a vocal quartet, oboe and cello. And that's it. It's wordless, as is L'Homme et son désir, which is also for the soprano, alto, tenor, bass vocal quartet with a small orchestra consisting of a dozen string, wind, and brass instruments and a lot of percussion. Very percussive. This is a very, very cool record. From the 49-cent bin, as it turns out. Anton Bruckner, Symphony No. 1, conducted by Eugen Joachim. I really like these Deutsche Grammophon Joachim series of the Bruckner symphonies with these architectural artworks on the cover. I did my spiel, maybe a year ago about Bruckner and what a weirdo he was, so I'll spare you this time. But last week I did take a quick trip up to San Francisco, and that was kind of a bad idea for the time, because about 2 blocks before where I was planning to get off the bus, the street was closed off, and the bus made a detour. I said, okay, I'm going somewhere else. I don't know where. And when I did get off and a stop about 4 blocks out of my way, I started noticing that even for San Francisco, there were an awful lot of men running around with no pants on, going, oh, it's the Folsom Street Fair today. So it's a big celebration of leather culture, and there are a lot of very interesting looking people out on the street that day. But I did manage to get to the record store I was heading for, and I picked up Steeleye Span, Now We Are 6. The title has a double meaning, aside from referring to the collection of poems by A.A. Milne. This is their 6th album, and it also marks the expansion of the band to a 6-piece with the addition of Nigel Pegram as the full-time drummer. They previously had not had a drummer. This has Ian Anderson credited as production consultant. I'm not sure how much he had to do. I think he said he didn't have a great deal of hands-on involvement with the recording, but He was more a supporting role, and he did manage to get David Bowie to come in as a guest musician, playing alto sax very badly, it must be said, on a cover of To Know Him Is to Love Him. A bit of a left turn for Steeleye Span, of course known for their adaptations of British folk music. This is a UK pressing with the lyric inner sleeve and the full 6-minute version of the song Thomas the Rhymer, which was cut down to 3 minutes on some other pressings. This is not a great favorite among Steeleye Span. It's still really good, but not one of my big favorites. And I think it's a bit of a mess as far as the programming goes, the track sequence. And I think that they must have had trouble with the track sequence. One of the peculiar things about this album, besides the inclusion of the old rock and roll song, Phil Spector, To Know Him Is to Love Him, is the inclusion of 2 little silly tracks where the band imitates children's voices, accompanied by piano, and they're pretending to be an elementary school choir with their teacher on piano, the Saint Eli, get it, Eli, with a primary school junior choir, doing Twinkle Twinkle Little Star and a set of riddles, which are the sort of riddles like, if you've read The Hobbit, the old kind of riddles, not funny jokes, but ones where you're supposed to figure out what they're talking about. The one where Bilbo cheats Gollum in the darkness, the riddles in the dark section. In fact, one of the riddles in this is the same as one of the riddles about the one about teeth. 30 white horses on a red hill, now they champ, now they tramp, now they stand still. That's the whole riddle. They don't give you the answer here, but the answer is teeth. Spoiler! Oh, I should have given a spoiler alert. Anyway, I was saying that the track sequencing seems to be problematic, and one issue was that I think band members have actually said, oh, we should have stuck that in at the end instead of having those 2 bits interspersed in the middle of the serious music. And another clue is that the credits for the songs, as they appear on the back cover, are not in the same order as the actual track listing. And the lyrics, as they appear on the sleeve, are in a different order altogether. So I think they must have been trying different track sequences, and I don't think they really succeeded. In particular, the opening song, 700 Elves, just doesn't sound like an opening song. Still a lot to enjoy on this album. That was the first of their albums with that classic mid-60s or mid-70s lineup with the sextet with Nigel Pegram. And this was the last of those albums, Rocket Cottage. And this was the second of 2 albums produced by Mike Batt of Remember You're a Womble fame. So this is Steeleye Span at their poppiest. The first album with Mike Batt in the producer's chair was All Around My Hat, which was a huge hit in Britain. The title track was a big hit. So that really brought them a lot of fame and attention, and so they brought him back for this album. I prefer this album over All Around My Hat. It's a little bit scrappy. At the end of the album, they include some studio fooling around that just seems to be padding out the album, but it is a lot of fun. Nice arrangement of Fighting for Strangers with a lot of sections where the vocals are just accompanied by percussion. It's just a lot of percussion and vocals. Interesting arrangement. Brown Girl is a great track. London is a good... London is a great way to open an album. That's where they've got this very bold, assertive beginning to the album. So that's something that Batt did do well for them. After this album, though, As this is, like I said, Steeleye Span at their poppiest. After this, Martin Carthy, who had been in the band in their early days, returned. And he brought with him John Kirkpatrick, and they brought back a lot of the Old English folk flavor that Steeleye had been kind of drifting away from. And speaking of Martin Carthy, here's his album Sweet Wivels Field. Shepherd, Oh Shepherd, Billy Boy, Three Jolly Sneaksmen. Great songs. Carthy always does classic interpretations of songs from the tradition. Into the world of prog. Got a lot of proggy things here. The Collectors Coliseum. This is a band that was treated very differently by their British and American record companies. So the records in England and America had very different track listings. So this collects some of the things that the British listeners didn't get because they were only on the American versions of the albums, as well as some other odd tracks, including their version of Ravel's Bolero, which is very cool. Another bit of a grail for me, the second album by Hatfield and the North, The Rotters Club. Not an original pressing, which would have been on the full-color Virgin Twin with Dragon label. This is apparently the third label. The second would have been this label, but with a border around it. I don't care. This is a nice pressing of a great Canterbury prog album. Mike Oldfield's second album, Amadon, picked this one up just yesterday. This was his follow-up, of course, to Tubular Bells, and one thing I hear in this music is all through it, it seems to be kind of variations on the theme from the last big section of side one of Tubular Bells, the part with the introductions of the instruments. The themes that run through this just really seem very reminiscent of this, but this is not as dense with ideas as Tubular Bells. This is more slow and even and just not quite as extraordinary as Tubular Bells, but nice stuff. On another trip to San Francisco recently, I picked up these two albums. Second album, it's a run of second albums by Rare Bird, As Your Mind Flies By. Nice sort of repeat of the American cover of their first album with this artwork. Both of these albums, the first and second album, were very different in packaging between the US and the UK. And the same day I picked up this album by Peter Hamill. The Rare Bird is from 1970. This is from 10 years later, 1980. But what these albums have in common is that on both of them, side 2 is taken up with a full side-long suite entitled Flight. So that's just prog for you. And speaking of Peter Hamill, this is the live album by Vandergraaf, the short-lived incarnation of the band when they dropped Generator from their name. Vital, double LP. This is the gatefold version. There was also a version that just had the two LPs stuffed in a single sleeve. Very raw. For prog music, this is very raw and has definitely some of the punkiness that was in the air at the time and was quite definitely inspired by Hamill in the first place. So you can't say he didn't come by it honestly. Mountain Live, just picked this up on a whim. It was cheap. Contains a full side-long version of Nantucket's Sleigh Ride. Great song. The Who direct hits. I've always had a soft spot for the really weird tracks that The Who put out, particularly on singles in the 60s. And this has a lot of that very oddball kind of novelty song stuff. It opens with their version of Jan and Dean's Bucket Tea. It has some of the songs that we know from their more serious hits albums like Meaty Beaty Big and Bouncy. It has I'm a Boy and Pictures of Lily, which themselves have a bit of a novelty aspect to them. Doctor, Doctor, one of John Entwistle's really wacky ones. It does have I Can See for Miles, Substitute, Happy Jack, their version of the Stones' Last Time, and it ends with Dogs, another very silly novelty type song. Despite being called direct hits, it doesn't have My Generation, which was, their for Americans, their first, I think, breakthrough hit, or the earlier British hits like Can't Explain. Those were on a different label, so Track couldn't include those. And it also doesn't include Magic Bus, which was a hit around the time this was released in 1968. But there you go. There's the track listing for you. There's a nice horse. Don't know why, just a horse. Got some doggies, got some knees. Interestingly random cover. Reminds me a little bit of that kind of Peter Blake stuff that's on their most recent album and was also on Face Dances. Okay, I'm going to have to do an edit here because the camera went down. This is another record that I picked up at that trip to San Francisco during the Folsom Street Fair. Bumpers, double LP collection of various artists on Island, just a sampler. Just a lot of really cool stuff on here. Traffic, Spooky Tooth doing their cover of I Am the Walrus, Mott the Hoople, Jethro Tull doing Nothing to Say, the Jethro Tull spin-off, Blood and Pigs, Send Your Son to Die, King Crimson, Cadence and Cascade, some folkier stuff, John and Beverly Martin and Nick Drake, of course, it's always brilliant. Fairport Convention with Walk a While and Fotheringay with The Sea, the original Renaissance with Jane Ralph doing Island, Cat Stevens, Maybe You're Right, Free is on here, Clouds, the early prog band with Take Me to Your Leader, Reaching Out on All Sides by If, great horn rock, and an unusual track by, by Dave Mason, sorry. Unusual track by Dave Mason, Little Woman, with no credit to where it's from because it's not on any album. It was the B-side of a solo single that Dave Mason, I keep wanting to say Nick Mason, I must have Pink Floyd on the brain, and I don't know why I would because I'm not showing any. A solo single that Dave Mason released as early as 1968. So that's what that is. And it's a fairly unusual song, and the backing band on it is Family. Dave Mason had produced their album, their first album, and apparently this was them returning the favor. Yesterday I just found this in the bargain bin and picked it up. I've never actually listened to a Dan Hicks and his Hot Licks album before, but this one does have a great song that I love, I Scare Myself, so I decided to pick it up. And I wasn't sure whether this was going to be a listen to it once and then give it away or keep it, but I think I'm keeping this one because it's pretty fun. Does not include the original inner sleeve. That's pretty much the only reason I know why it would have been in the 49-cent bin, but there you go. And one thing I'd like to know is, I think this handwritten text looks an awful lot like the guy who wrote all the text on the Amazing Cornyphone bootleg series all through the 70s. And I wonder if that's the same guy. Another San Francisco band, Country Joe and the Fish, of course the classic electric music for the mind and body, featuring the great song I bought this for originally was Not So Sweet Martha Lorraine. That's the one that got the airplay in my part of the world. Grace, closing song, is another wonderful, wonderful track. Otherwise a pretty fun album. And at the same time I found that one, I found this, the second one, Feel Like I'm Fixin' to Die. And this actually does include the Fish game. Usually when you find this album, the game is missing, or if it's present, it's been cut up. But this actually does include an intact copy of the Fish game. So there it is in all its glory. And while we're in the Bay Area, Hot Tuna's first album, complete with the original inner sleeve, which I always thought was very great and very creepy looking. And that brings us to the blues. To close out this video, John Mayall, The Turning Point. His turn was to acoustic music, where he abandoned the hard-hitting electric Blues Breakers sound and assembled his band of John Mark on acoustic guitar, Steve Thompson on bass, and Johnny Almond on saxophone and flute. This includes the great late-night FM classic from the early 70s, California, as well as the best-known song from here, Room to Move. And this copy does include the little insert with the lyrics and various photos. And that's it. Thank you for sticking it out. Be well. Talk with you again soon. Bye-bye for now.